Serial killers are often born from tragedy, and Pedro Alonso López is no exception. Known as the Monster of the Andes, López's story is a chilling example of how childhood trauma can create a monster. Born in Colombia in 1948, López faced abandonment, abuse, and violence from an early age. These experiences warped his mind, setting him on a dark path that would lead to unthinkable crimes. As an adult, López claimed to have raped and murdered over 300 young girls across South America. His ability to evade capture for years by targeting poor communities made his crimes even more horrifying. Despite eventually being caught and imprisoned, López's story doesn't end there. After serving just 14 years, he was released and soon vanished. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown, leaving many to wonder if he is still out there, possibly continuing his terrible acts. This is the chilling story of the Monster of the Andes. A dark, traumatized childhood. Pedro Alonso López's childhood was a terrible experience that clearly played a role in turning him into a depraved criminal later in life. Born into a poor and violent home, López suffered many abuses and terrible events from a very young age that corrupted his innocence and started him down an evil path. Pedro Alonso López was born on October 8, 1948 in Venadillo, Tolima, Colombia. López's early years were full of instability and neglect. His father was killed before he was born, during a brutal 10-year civil war in Colombia, La Violencia. This left López to be raised by his single mother, a prostitute who often brought clients into their home. López described her as mean and abusive, a bad parent to him and his 12 siblings. When López was just 8 years old, his mother caught him touching his younger sister inappropriately. As punishment, she kicked him out of the house and onto the streets. This shocking abandonment left the young boy completely alone and helpless in the slums of Bogotá. Preyed upon by predators. Life on the streets for López was a waking nightmare of manipulation and betrayal. Predatory adults sexually abused the homeless child, tricking him with offers of food and a place to stay before attacking him. Desperate for safety, López joined a gang of other street kids. However, this only exposed him to more violence and bad influences. The gang often got into knife fights with other groups over small things like food and places to sleep. López also started using bazuco, a dirty, toxic form of cocaine, at a very young age. A brief moment of hope came when López was taken in by an American family at age 12 and started going to school. Sadly, this did not last, as he was sexually abused again, this time by a teacher. Running away from this, López went back to the streets and a life of crime, stealing cars to get by. The roots of evil. The constant trauma, abuse, and terrible experiences of López's childhood had a disastrous impact on his mental health and growth. Robbed of safety, stability, and healthy relationships, his young mind was warped by the cruelty he faced, which molded him to gain pleasure from the evil crimes he would commit as an adult. While inexcusable, they clearly have their roots in the hellish things that happened in his earliest years. Incarceration and revenge. In 1969, at age 21, López was arrested for car theft and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Just 2 days into his sentence, he was gang raped by 3 other inmates, an event that left him deeply traumatized. Seeking revenge, López fashioned a makeshift knife and hunted down his attackers, killing all 3. Some accounts claim there was a 4th attacker who escaped. The prison killings were ruled as self-defense, with only 2 years added to López's sentence. He gained the respect of other inmates and was left alone after the incident. López completed his sentence in 1978 at the age of 30, after which he started wandering through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. This is when he began his terrible murder spree. Killing spree across South America. Upon his release from prison, López later claimed he began abducting, raping, and murdering young girls, mainly from poor indigenous communities. He said he killed over 100 victims during this time, though these early claims are unverified. On one occasion, López attempted to abduct a 9-year-old girl from the Ayacucho indigenous tribe in Peru, but was caught in the act by the tribe. As punishment, the men of the village buried him up to his neck in the sand and planned to pour syrup on his head to be eaten alive by ants. However, an American missionary intervened and convinced the tribe to turn López over to the police instead. The unaware missionary drove López to the Colombia-Ecuador border, where she released him, believing the police would detain him. However, the police did not arrest him, and he was set free to continue his crimes. Heading to Ecuador, López resumed abducting and killing indigenous girls from small villages. The number of missing children began to rise in the areas he passed through. Authorities initially believed the disappearances were due to human trafficking rings, not suspecting that a lone serial killer was on the loose. López's method involved stalking his victims for unknown periods of time before luring them away from public areas with trinkets and gifts. He targeted girls between the ages of 9-12, later claiming he was sparing them from the cruel life of poverty and abuse. Once isolated, he would rape then strangle the children with his bare hands before burying the bodies in shallow graves, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4. The end of the monster's reign. López's crimes finally caught up with him in April 1980 in Ambato, Ecuador, when he tried to kidnap 12-year-old Maria Povda from a busy market. The child's mother, Carvana, and a group of vigilant vendors managed to foil his sinister plan, overpowering the monster and restraining him until the authorities arrived. While López was being held, he refused to talk to male officers. Police Captain Pastor Cordova decided to try a nicer approach, giving López food and cigarettes. After some friendly talk, Cordova asked López if he knew anything about missing girls in the area. To Cordova's shock, López looked up and calmly said, "Over 200 in Ecuador, some 10s in Peru, and many more in Colombia." He agreed to show the police where he had buried his victims. At first, López took the authorities to the bodies of 53 victims in shallow grave sites around Ambato. As the bodies were dug up, the true size of his crimes became clear. Many of the graves had been emptied by floods and wild animals, eating the decaying bodies before they could be found. When asked why he did it, López reportedly said, "I lost my innocence at age 8. So I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." López was officially charged with 110 counts of murder in Ecuador, though he claimed he had killed at least 240 more girls in Colombia and Peru. Ecuador's laws at the time only allowed a maximum prison term of 16 years, which López got in 1980. A monster set free. After serving just 14 years of his 16-year prison term, the horrible child killer Pedro Alonso López was let out of Ecuador's García Moreno de Quito prison on August 31, 1994. Shockingly, López had been seen as a perfect prisoner during his time in jail, even becoming friends with another serial killer named Daniel Camargo. In a chilling interview before he was freed, López boldly called himself the man of the century and bragged that he was getting out early for good behavior, which was a twisted joke considering his crimes. But López's freedom didn't last long. Right after he was released, Colombian authorities grabbed him and arrested him for being in the country illegally. López desperately tried to stop them from sending him back to Colombia, saying he had become an Ecuadorian citizen in 1974, but he couldn't prove it. Once in Bogotá, an angry crowd gathered outside as López was getting a medical checkup, wanting to kill him themselves. Yet amazingly, Colombian officials found they couldn't charge López for his earlier terrible crimes. Instead of putting him back in prison, López was deemed to be criminally insane and sent to a mental hospital in 1995. After only 3 years of supposed treatment, López was judged sane in a new evaluation. Incredibly, he was let go in 1998 on a tiny $50 bail. with the only rule being that he had to report to authorities every month and keep getting psychiatric help. As one might expect, López completely ignored this, quickly disappearing without a trace. Sightings and rumors. The last time anyone definitely saw the child-killing monster was in 1999, when he had the nerve to go to a government office in Colombia to get a new ID card. There were also unproven rumors of him being in northern Ecuador around that same time, a terrifying thought for the families of his many victims. In 2002, Colombian police issued an arrest warrant for López, thinking he was behind a new murder that matched his horrible way of killing. But once again, López escaped capture, his location unknown. The news that López was free caused great fear in Ecuador. In a strange twist, López showed up in El Espinal, boldly knocking on the door of his own mother, Benilda. The poor woman was afraid for her life, remembering how López had blamed her for every pain in his heart in a TV interview years before. She had begged then for her son to never be released. Yet López calmly told his mother to kneel before him, saying he wanted to give her his blessing. He then demanded his inheritance in life, arguing he had no way to support himself. Benilda gave him a small amount of money from a drawer and an old bed, which López took apart and sold for parts. She never saw her son again, and where he is remains a mystery. Chillingly, a new murder in El Espinal in 22 had all the signs of López's awful handiwork. Colombian police launched an international order for his arrest, but to no avail. Rumors spread about López's fate, that he hides in the Tolima department of Colombia, that he wanders the streets of Bogotá as a homeless man, or that angry relatives of his victims finally got their own justice by putting a price on his head. To this day, the monster of the Andes is still free, his location and murderous activities unknown. Whether López has started killing again or finally met a grim end himself, the scars he left on countless families and communities will never heal. Legacy of a monster. The revelation of Pedro Alonso López's crimes shocked and horrified the world. That a single individual could rape and murder over 100 children, possibly as many as 300, was unfathomable. His ability to evade capture for years by preying on poor and vulnerable indigenous communities compounded the tragedy. Despite the depravity of his actions, López served a relatively short prison sentence due to Ecuador's lenient laws at the time. His release and subsequent disappearance has been a source of anger and frustration for the families of his many victims. What is certain is the lasting impact of López's crimes. He viciously cut short the lives of hundreds of innocent children in multiple countries. The pain and suffering he inflicted is immeasurable. While the true number of López's victims may never be known, his legacy as one of history's most prolific and evil serial killers is cemented. The monster of the Andes remains a terrifying specter and a tragic reminder of the cruelty that humans are capable of. The story of Pedro Alonso López is a deeply disturbing one, full of unimaginable violence against society's most vulnerable. Yet it is also a story that must be told to honor the memory of his victims and to ensure such evil is never forgotten or repeated. May the children he murdered rest in peace, and may López face justice, in this life or the next, for his monstrous crimes. Aum Shinrikyo, Japan's deadliest cult. The tragic story of Shoko Asahara and his doomsday cult, Aum Shinrikyo, begins in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo in 1984. In the heart of Tokyo, a small yoga class led by a partially blind man named Chizuo Matsumoto grew into one of the most dangerous cults in modern history. What started as a peaceful meditation group turned into a doomsday cult that shocked the world with its violent acts. Asahara, once a failed politician and acupuncturist, became a bearded guru who claimed he could save his followers from the end of the world. He mixed ideas from Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity to create a dangerous belief system. Over time, Aum Shinrikyo went from teaching yoga to making deadly weapons and plotting terrorist attacks. Their actions brought tragedy, leaving many dead and thousands injured. The cult's darkest moment came in 1995 with a nerve gas attack on Tokyo's subway, an event that changed Japan forever. Asahara's early life. The birth of the Dark Messiah. Shoko Asahara was born Chizuo Matsumoto on March 2, 1955 in Kumamoto Prefecture, Japan. He was one of 4 children in a poor family of tatami mat makers. Matsumoto was born partially blind and lost all sight in his left eye at a young age. He was sent to a school for the blind at age 6 and never lived with his family again. As a child, Matsumoto discovered he could earn money and popularity by guiding other students at the school to a local candy shop. But he also developed a reputation as a bully, beating up and extorting money from other students. During his teenage years, Matsumoto had grandiose fantasies of one day ruling Japan as a robot king. After graduating in 1973, Matsumoto's application to study at Tokyo University was rejected. He instead studied acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, later opening a small pharmacy in Chiba Prefecture selling unregulated health drinks. In 1981, Matsumoto was fined for practicing medicine without a license. Around this time, Matsumoto became interested in religion and spirituality. Recently married with children to support, he studied a variety of new religious movements and esoteric practices in his spare time, from Christianity and Hinduism to yoga and Buddhism. He soon adopted the name Shoko Asahara, started wearing white robes, and began promoting himself as a spiritual guru. Founding Aum Shinrikyo. In 1984, Asahara started a meditation group called Aumu Shinsen no Kai, later renamed Aum Shinrikyo, Religion of Supreme Truth. Operating out of a 1-bedroom apartment in Tokyo, the group initially focused on yoga, meditation, and Asahara's unique interpretations of Buddhism. Asahara claimed to have achieved enlightenment during a trip to India in 1986. He said he had been given a mission to lead the armies of the gods, and that Aum members would survive the coming apocalypse, which he predicted would occur in 1997 or 2000. Borrowing from the Book of Revelation, Asahara identified the United States as the Beast and said it would attack Japan, instigating World War III. While Asahara's apocalyptic predictions might have seemed far-fetched to outsiders, they were just the beginning of a descent into darkness that would soon engulf not only his followers, but all of Japan. In the early days, Aum Shinrikyo managed to fly under the radar in Japan, not yet linked to any major crimes. But behind the scenes, Asahara was becoming increasingly fixated on apocalyptic biblical prophecies, convinced that doomsday was near. To spread his doomsday message, Aum launched a savvy media campaign. The cult published its own manga, comics, and anime, weaving its radical religious ideas into popular themes like space exploration, futuristic weapons, global conspiracies, and the search for hidden truths. Aum's magazines, like Vajrayana Saka and Enjoy Happiness, took on a missionary tone, aiming to impress educated Japanese who found traditional religious sermons dull. Aum even amassed a sizable following in Russia. Asahara was particularly taken with Isaac Asimov's Foundation sci-fi novels, which told of an enlightened group of scientists forced underground during a dark age, patiently waiting for the right moment to emerge and rebuild society. Asahara saw Aum as playing a similar messianic role. Deceptive recruitment tactics. Aum Shinrikyo's recruitment efforts. The Aum Salvation Plan made exciting promises to potential members. They claimed joining would heal sicknesses, help people reach their full potential, and achieve their goals through ancient teachings and meditation. These promises were alluring, attracting people from all walks of life, including government workers, military members, and police. However, a more sinister reality was hiding beneath the surface. Aum faced accusations of lying to and manipulating recruits, forcing members to stay against their will, and making followers give them money. There were even rumors Aum had killed a member who tried to leave in 1989. Becoming a member allegedly involved taking hallucinogenic drugs like LSD. The group's supposed religious practices often served as a cover for abuse, with scared recruits being hung upside down or given electric shocks under the guise of yoga. Aum's hospitals were reportedly a scheme to extort money, with the cult making patients pay enormous bills. By the end of the 1980s, Aum Shinrikyo was mired in serious controversy, with allegations of deception, confinement, robbery, and murder surrounding the group. But this was only the beginning of Asahara's dark journey into mass violence. Sakamoto family murder. Aum Shinrikyo committed its first known murder in 1989. Tsutsumi Sakamoto, a lawyer working on a class action lawsuit against the cult, mysteriously disappeared along with his wife and infant son. Sakamoto had taped an interview with Tokyo Broadcasting System Television (TBS) about his efforts to expose Aum's crimes. But in a shocking betrayal, TBS secretly showed the interview tape to Aum members, violating Sakamoto's confidentiality. Aum leaders then pressured the network to cancel the broadcast. Days later, on November 3, 1989, several top Aum members, including the cult's chief scientist and a martial arts master, drove to Sakamoto's home in Yokohama. Armed with deadly potassium chloride and syringes, they planned to kidnap Sakamoto. But he unexpectedly stayed home that day with his family. In the early hours of November 5th, the Aum hit squad crept into Sakamoto's apartment through an unlocked door. 33-year-old Tsutsumi was killed with a hammer, injected with the poison, and strangled. His wife Satoko, 29, was also beaten and injected. Even their 14-month-old baby Tatsuhiko was injected with potassium chloride and suffocated. The cult killers hid the family's bodies in metal drums scattered across remote rural areas, and mutilated the corpses to prevent identification. The Sakamotos were not found until years later, reduced to bones. TBS kept the damning interview secret until 1996, leading to accusations they had contributed to the Sakamoto family's murder by tipping off the cult. Aum's escalating violence. In the early 1990s, Aum Shinrikyo's activities took an even darker turn. The cult began plotting to assassinate critics and opponents, including leaders of rival religious groups. In 1993, they even attempted to kill a cartoonist who had mocked Aum in his satirical work. Aum's tactics grew more sophisticated. In 1991, the cult stole phone company uniforms and equipment to wiretap people illegally. They then wrote a manual on wiretapping, nerve gas, and assassinations. In July 1993, Aum carried out a failed bioterror attack in Tokyo. Cult members sprayed liquid containing anthrax spores from their headquarters rooftop, trying to cause an epidemic. Many complained of foul odors, but luckily no one got sick. The next year, in June 1994, the cult committed its next major attack. Aum released deadly sarin nerve gas in a neighborhood in the city of Matsumoto. They were targeting judges involved in a lawsuit against the cult. The sarin attack killed 8 people and hospitalized many more. Later that year, Aum began secretly scaling up their manufacturing of chemical weapons like sarin and VX nerve gas. They tested sarin on sheep at a remote Australian farm, killing 29. Over the next 2 years, the cult used these deadly substances to assassinate several people. Aum's sinister plans. The cult also tried to steal classified documents on military hardware like tanks and artillery from a Mitsubishi factory in late 1994. In December 1994 and January 1995, Aum used VX in attacks on 3 individuals. One victim, suspected by Asahara of being a spy, was sprayed with VX and died after 10 days in a coma. Another target, a vocal critic of the cult, was assassinated the same way. In February 1995, Aum abducted and murdered a 69-year-old man, the brother of a cult member who had escaped. They killed him at an Aum compound, burned his body in a special microwave incinerator, and dumped his remains in a lake. The man had received death threats demanding to know where his sister was. As police prepared for nationwide raids on Aum in March 1995, the increasingly paranoid Asahara allegedly ordered the Tokyo subway attack to divert attention. The cult was also trying to mass-produce AK-47 rifles in preparation for a showdown with authorities. Police found rifle parts and plans in an Aum vehicle that April. These incidents show how Aum Shinrikyo evolved from a fringe religious group into an increasingly violent criminal organization, willing to commit murder, terrorism, and mass destruction under Shoko Asahara's twisted ideology and cult leadership. And with each passing month, Aum's attacks grew bolder and more deadly. But even these heinous acts would pale in comparison to the horror that was about to unfold in the heart of Tokyo. Hell on the Metro. On the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 Aum members boarded crowded subway trains in Tokyo during rush hour, carrying bags of sarin. They punctured the bags with umbrellas, releasing toxic fumes into the packed cars before escaping. The coordinated attack struck 5 trains on 3 subway lines that converged at the Kasumagaski station, near the Japanese parliament and many government ministries. Commuters suddenly found themselves struggling to breathe, blinded by agonizing eye pain. Sarin, originally developed as a pesticide, is a nerve agent 26 times deadlier than cyanide. Exposure causes a brutal cascade of symptoms within seconds, starting with a runny nose and tightness in the chest and escalating to nausea, vomiting, seizures, respiratory shutdown, and death. Panicked riders poured out of stations, gasping for air and collapsing on the street. Passers-by stopped to help, not realizing they too were being poisoned by the colorless, odorless gas coming off victims' clothing. Hospitals were overwhelmed with thousands suffering from sarin exposure. In total, 13 people died and over 6,000 were injured, some permanently. It remains the worst terrorist attack in Japanese history. Arrests and raids. The subway attack was a wake-up call for Japanese authorities, who had been reluctant to crack down on Aum despite years of suspected crimes. Police launched raids on Aum compounds across Japan, uncovering stunning evidence of the cult's militarization. At Aum's headquarters at the foot of Mount Fuji, police found tons of chemicals for producing sarin, a military helicopter, cells holding prisoners, and biological warfare agents like anthrax and Ebola. They seized millions in cash and gold, as well as wiretapping equipment and an electric chair used to punish disobedient followers. Over 150 Aum members were arrested in the following months. Asahara had gone into hiding, but was found on May 16, 1995, in a tiny crawlspace in an Aum building, where he had been concealed in complete darkness for weeks. He was arrested and charged with masterminding the subway attack and numerous other crimes. Dozens of Aum's top members were also arrested and put on trial. Trials and executions. Asahara's trial for the subway attack and other charges began in 1996, but would drag on for over 7 years, becoming Japan's longest and most expensive trial ever. Asahara never confessed or apologized, maintaining a vow of silence throughout the proceedings. In court, he would slip into incoherent ramblings, make confusing statements, and often sit silently. Some of Asahara's followers testified against him, providing details of his orders to commit murder and terrorism. In 2004, Asahara was found guilty of masterminding the sarin attack and other crimes and sentenced to death. His multiple appeals were rejected, and the sentence was finalized in 2006. On July 6, 2018, Asahara was executed by hanging at age 63, along with 6 other senior Aum members. Another 6 cult members were hanged later that month. Announcing the executions, Japan's justice minister said the crimes plunged people, not only in Japan but in other countries as well, into deadly fear and shook society to its core. Aftermath and legacy. In the years after Asahara's arrest, Aum Shinrikyo went bankrupt and was stripped of its religious status. The group split into two factions, Aleph and Hikari no Wa, which claimed to have renounced violence and Asahara's teachings. However, Japanese authorities continue to monitor both groups, believing they still pose a danger. The Aum Shinrikyo attacks deeply scarred the Japanese psyche and shattered the nation's sense of safety. The cult's militarization and turn to terrorism went undetected for years, exposing failures in law enforcement and intelligence. For many, it was a disturbing reminder that apocalyptic cults and homegrown extremism could emerge even in a country known for its low crime and social order. Asahara, once a charismatic guru with thousands of devoted followers, is now despised in Japan as a mass murderer and terrorist mastermind. His legacy is one of destruction, fear, and trauma inflicted on innocent people in the name of a doomsday cult. The story of Aum Shinrikyo remains a chilling reminder of how a small group, led by a persuasive, charismatic leader with an apocalyptic vision, can unleash shocking acts of violence on an unsuspecting society. The tragic story of the Lonely Hearts Killers begins with two lost souls, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. Damaged by life and desperate for love, they found each other through a Lonely Hearts ad in 1947. But instead of a happily ever after, their twisted relationship led them down a dark path of deception, betrayal, and murder. Posing as brother and sister, they lured lonely women with promises of love, only to rob and brutally kill them. By the time they were finally caught in 1949, they had left a trail of up to 20 victims across the country. This is the chilling tale of how loneliness and obsession can warp the human heart, transforming love into something monstrous. This is the story of the Lonely Hearts Killers. Raymond Fernandez, the charming con man. Raymond Martinez Fernandez and Martha Jewel Beck paths crossed in 1947, setting off a deadly chain of events. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born in 1914 in Hawaii to Spanish parents. As a young man, he moved to Spain to work on his uncle's farm. There, he married a local woman named Encarnacion and started a family, having 4 children. But Fernandez was not content with domestic life. He abandoned his wife and children and set off in search of adventure. During World War II, Fernandez served in Spain's merchant marines and later worked with the British government as a spy, where he garnered a good reputation for carrying out his duties. When the war ended, Fernandez died to return to America to seek employment and send for his wife and children. On one fateful voyage to the Dutch West Indies, a steel hatch cover fell directly on his head, causing a severe indentation of his skull that damaged his frontal lobe and some suggest irreversibly altered his personality. After a lengthy hospitalization, he fell into a life of petty crime and was eventually sent to prison for theft. It was there that his cellmate, a Haitian man, introduced Fernandez to the practice of voodoo. Fernandez became convinced that these dark rituals gave him an irresistible power over women. Upon his release, Fernandez began answering Lonely Hearts ads placed by single women looking for love. Charming and handsome, he easily won their affection and trust. In October 1947, Fernandez began courting Jane Lucilla Thompson, a recently separated woman. Using her money, they took a cruise to Spain where Fernandez was still married to his first wife, Encarnacion Robles. He brazenly introduced Jane to Encarnacion, and the three dined out together in La Linea. On November 7, 1947, after an apparent fight between Raymond and Jane at their hotel, Jane was found dead the next morning of unknown causes. Her body was buried without an autopsy. Fernandez quickly fled back to the U.S., leaving High family behind once more. Using a forged will, Fernandez took over Jane's New York apartment, ruthlessly evicting her elderly mother in the process. Suspicions later arose that Jane was poisoned. But Fernandez was after more than love. He was a con man who seduced these lonely women and then robbed them of their savings before moving on to his next mark. In 1947, Fernandez met Martha Beck through a Lonely Hearts ad, and his life took an even darker turn. Martha Beck's troubled past. Martha Jewel Beck entered the world in 1920 in Milton, Florida. From a young age, life weighed heavily upon her. Glandular problems caused premature puberty and obesity, making her the target of cruel bullying and torment from classmates and her own mother. Even worse, Beck later claimed she suffered sexual abuse at the hands of her brother, while her mother turned a blind eye. Beck found solace in romance novels and nursing school, eventually becoming a licensed nurse. But her weight and troubled past made it difficult to find steady work or love. Whilst working at an army hospital in California, she would frequent the local bars at night picking up soldiers. One of those one-night stands led to her falling pregnant with her first child in 1944. On hearing the news, the soldier made a failed attempt to kill himself by jumping in the California Bay. Beck never saw him again. After the short stint in California, Beck moved back to Florida, where she met local bus driver Alfred Beck. The two casually dated. When she fell pregnant with a boy, they decided to marry. However, this union of duty was short-lived, and he divorced her after 6 months. As a single mother of 2, she took a job at a hospital for children in Pensacola and escaped further into her fantasy world of romance films and literature. Desperately lonely, Beck placed a Lonely Hearts ad in 1947. When Raymond Fernandez responded, Beck thought she had finally found her Prince Charming. They sent letters back and forth over 2 weeks, and Fernandez presented himself as a successful businessman from Spain who had settled in New York for new opportunities. Knowing that Beck was a nurse, he complimented her full heart and great capacity for comfort and love. Beck eagerly anticipated their romantic union, especially so after Fernandez requested a lock of her hair. Little did she know that Fernandez wanted it to perform his usual voodoo rituals. Fernandez visited Beck in Florida, and she quickly fell under his spell. Meanwhile, he was using the opportunity to scope out her assets and determine if she was worth the effort to defraud. He met her children and spent the evening intimately with Beck before he decided to return to New York. Beck insisted that they stay in Florida and get married, but Fernandez made clear that he had no intention to stop his business in New York. To soothe her protests, he assured her he would come back soon or send money for her to join him. Beck naively saw this as a proposal of sorts and quickly informed people in her neighborhood that they would be marrying. In New York, Fernandez attempted to back away from his promise, and a distraught Beck attempted suicide in a fit of anguish. He then agreed to let her visit him in New York, where they spent 2 weeks together. On returning to Florida, Beck was fired without explanation at the hospital, which she had been excelling at as a supervisor. Seeing this as a sign, she dressed her kids, packed some bags, and got on a bus to New York City. She arrived at Fernandez's doorstep with her children. Whilst Fernandez did not object to having Beck around, having the children was a hindrance he did not desire. He convinced Beck to get rid of them. Obediently, Beck abandoned both her children at a Salvation Army on January 25, 1948. Noting her Beck's undying loyalty and willingness to cater to his whims, Fernandez confessed his crimes to her, and rather than being repulsed, Beck was intoxicated by the adventure and danger. She agreed to help him seduce and rob lonely women. Posing as Fernandez's sister to allay any suspicions, Beck watched as he romanced other women, her jealousy building to a frenzy. If Fernandez paid too much attention to his intended victim, Beck's rage exploded. She ruthlessly eliminated any woman who posed a threat to her relationship with Fernandez. Together, they would eventually graduate from theft to murder. The murder spree victims of the Lonely Hearts. Together, they made plans for their next victim. As they pored over photographs of widows and Lonely Hearts ads, they settled upon Miss Esther Henn in southern Pennsylvania. The odd-looking pair traveled to Pennsylvania, where they met with Miss Henn in February 1948. And within the month, they were married in Fairfax, Virginia. He was polite to her for a few days, but then became abusive when she wouldn't sign over her insurance policies and pension to him. Hen left the relationship, robbed of her car and hundreds of dollars by Fernandez. Their next target was Myrtle Young of Arkansas. Fernandez married Young on August 14, 1948 in Illinois, with Beck posing as his sister. Beck did everything she could to prevent the marriage from being consummated, even sleeping in the same bed as Young. When Young protested, Fernandez drugged her into unconsciousness. He then sent Young back to Arkansas on a bus, robbed of $4,000. Young died in a hospital the next day. In late 1948, Fernandez began courting Janet Faye, a 66-year-old widow from Albany, New York. Under his moniker, Charles Martin, Fernandez played on Faye's devout Catholicism by heavily referencing God and religion in their correspondence. They finally met in downtown Albany and spent time getting acquainted. Beck was introduced as Fernandez's sister, and within a few days Faye excitedly agreed to marry Fernandez. In early January 1949, she withdrew over $6,000 from her bank accounts to start their new life together. On January 4th, Faye left Albany with Fernandez and Beck to a rented apartment on Long Island. Varying accounts cloud the full events, but when Beck was left alone with Faye for this first time, in a fit of jealous rage, Beck bludgeoned Faye with a hammer and strangled her to death with a scarf. They stuffed Faye's body in a trunk and had Fernandez's sister unwittingly store it at her apartment for several days before Fernandez returned to retrieve and bury the trunk in the cellar of a rented house. To cover their tracks, they sent several letters to Faye's family members by typewriter depicting how happy she was with her new husband. The problem was, Faye did not own a typewriter and did not know how to type. The family immediately notified the police. The deadly couple then targeted Delphine Downing, a young widow with a 2-year-old daughter in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In late January 1949, Fernandez began consummating his relationship with Downing, much to Beck's anger. When Downing discovered Fernandez without his toupee, she threatened to go to the police, feeling she had been deceived about his baldness and scar. Beck gave her some sleeping pills to try to calm her down. Downing's daughter began to persistently cry with her mother asleep, and in a frustrated rage Beck choked Downing's crying daughter Raynell, leaving visible bruises on her neck. Fernandez then shot and killed Downing with her deceased husband's pistol, so she couldn't report them to the police. After staying in the house for 2 days planning their escape, cashing checks and stealing valuables, Fernandez told Beck to get rid of Raynell, who wouldn't stop crying. Beck drowned the little girl in a metal tub of dirty water in the basement before Fernandez buried the body in a small hole next to her mother. Rather than leave immediately, the couple stayed in town to watch a movie. By the time they arrived back to the apartment to pack their bags, they received a visit from 2 police officers who promptly arrested them, having been alerted by suspicious neighbors on February 28, 1949. The trial. The trial of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck was a media sensation. Tabloids dubbed them the Lonely Hearts Killers, and the public was fascinated by Beck's obesity and Fernandez's Latin charm. The proceedings took place in the summer of 1949 at the Bronx Criminal Court. Due to the brutality of the Downing murders and Michigan's lack of death penalty, the state of New York extradited the couple to stand trial for the murder of Janet Faye, the only killing that took place in New York. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Police had found Faye's personal effects, including a distinctive ring, in the couple's possession. Fernandez had also cashed checks from Faye's account. Initially, Fernandez claimed that Beck was his sister and had nothing to do with the murders. He confessed to killing Faye, but said it was in self-defense after she attacked him for sleeping with other women. However, under interrogation, he admitted this was a lie to protect Beck. Fernandez then claimed he was completely under Beck's control and that she was the mastermind behind the murders. Beck, on the other hand, portrayed herself as an unwitting pawn, blindly in love with Fernandez and unaware of his criminal activities. She said she thought the women were only being robbed, not murdered, Beck's defense also focused heavily on her weight, trying to garner sympathy from the jury. Her lawyer described her as a fat, unlovely, and tragic woman who was slavishly devoted to Fernandez. Throughout the trial, the couple's strange relationship was on full display. They constantly bickered and accused each other of lying, yet also exchanged tender glances and words of affection. Fernandez called Beck "my girl," and she gazed at him adoringly from the defense table. Their story of twisted love and murder enthralled the nation. In the end, the jury didn't buy either of their defenses. After deliberating for only 37 minutes, they returned a guilty verdict. Both Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were sentenced to death. Beck became hysterical upon hearing the sentence, screaming, "I'm innocent, my story is true," as she was dragged from the courtroom by matrons. Fernandez merely clicked his tongue and said, "Oh well, I guess that's that." Execution and aftermath. On March 8, 1951, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were executed side by side in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Fernandez was put to death first. After 3 jolts of electricity, he was pronounced dead at 11 p.m. Moments later, it was Martha Beck's turn. She was the 6th and last woman to be executed at Sing Sing. Prison officials said she was composed at the end, whispering prayers until the current hit. In the years since their deaths, the story of the Lonely Hearts Killers has continued to fascinate the public. Their crimes have inspired numerous books, films, and television shows. In 1970, the low-budget film The Honeymoon Killers offered a gritty take on their story. The 26 movie Lonely Hearts featured Salma Hayek as Beck and Jared Leto as Fernandez. But perhaps the most telling legacy of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck is the light their case shone on the post-war loneliness epidemic. In a time before online dating, personal ads were a common way for people to seek companionship. The Lonely Hearts Killers exploited this vulnerability in the cruelest way possible. Their victims were women on the margins of society, widows, single mothers, spinsters who were searching for love and connection. In Fernandez, they thought they had found a chance at happiness, only to have their lives brutally cut short. The tragic irony is that it was loneliness that drove both the victims and the killers into each other's paths. In the end, the story of the Lonely Hearts Killers is a cautionary tale about the perils of isolation and the desperate lengths people will go to find companionship. It's a reminder that even the most basic human need, the need for love and belonging, can be twisted into something dark and deadly. In our next case, we dive deep into the dark mind of Seth Gonzalez. Our tragic story begins with a panicked phone call to Sydney police on July 10, 2001. 20-year-old Seth Gonzalez cries out that he's returned home to find a gruesome scene. His mother, father, and sister have been brutally murdered. Racist graffiti is scrawled on the walls. Who could have committed such a heinous crime against this religious Filipino-Australian family? As the investigation unfolds, suspicion turns to Seth himself. Could this baby-faced son have slaughtered his own family in cold blood? Let's uncover this chilling true crime story of the Gonzalez family murders. The Gonzalez family. The Gonzalez family lived what seemed an ideal life in the quiet Sydney suburb of North Ryde. Parents Teddy and Mary had emigrated from the Philippines in the 1990s, following an earthquake that uprooted their comfortable lives there. Despite this, they built a successful life in Australia. Teddy worked as an immigration lawyer, while Mary was the secretary at the family firm. Their 2 children, 20-year-old Seth and 18-year-old Claudine, were both students. The family were devout and active members of their local Catholic church, and from the outside the Gonzalez family appeared close-knit. But behind closed doors the household was brewing in tension. Teddy and Mary had high hopes and strict expectations for their children, particularly Seth. They wanted him to excel academically, but his ability and interest never matched the demands they had. After attending Parramatta Marist High School, Seth enrolled in medical science at the University of New South Wales, but withdrew after 2 years due to poor performance. He then switched to studying law at Macquarie University. Secretly, Seth was an aspiring celebrity who dreamed of fame and fortune through a career in the entertainment industry. He harbored fantasies of his stardom and traits that many suggested was full-blown narcissism, including a compulsive tendency to lie. In one telling example of this troubling behavior, he falsely convinced his friends that he was dying from cancer. His meek disposition and apparent sincerity often made his claims seem believable. Seth's grades continued to suffer with his law degree, putting him at risk of expulsion. Rather than seek help for his academic struggles, Seth resorted to falsifying his grades in an attempt to deceive his parents. When Seth's sister exposed his lies, his parents threatened to take away privileges like use of his beloved green Ford Festiva. Arguments with his mother Mary over a girlfriend she disapproved of only further fanned the flames of rage Seth had internalized. The threat of being disinherited from the family's assets was the blow to his ego and sense of entitlement that descended into an evil plot to slaughter his family. The murders. On the evening of July 10th, Seth put his sinister plan into action. Armed with a baseball bat and kitchen knives, he lay in wait for his family to come home. Sister Claudine was first to arrive around 4:30 p.m. and went to her room to study. Seth followed, bludgeoning her with a bat and stabbing her repeatedly. Claudine suffered devastating head injuries and stab wounds to her neck and torso. Seth's frenzied attack left her dead in a pool of blood. An hour later, Mary arrived home from work. As she entered the house, Seth ambushed his mother in a surprise attack, stabbing her multiple times. She suffered gruesome wounds to her face, neck, chest, and stomach. Seth slashed her throat so viciously her windpipe was dissected. Mary's body was found in the living room. Teddy, the family patriarch, was last to arrive home around 6:50 p.m. Seth repeated his pattern, viciously stabbing his father as soon as he walked through the door. Teddy was knifed in the neck, chest, back, and abdomen, his lung punctured and spinal cord severed. Signs of a struggle suggested Teddy tried to fight back against his son to no avail. He became the third and final victim of Seth's killing spree. The cover-up. With his family lying dead, Seth set about covering his tracks. He took the murder weapons and his blood-stained clothes and shoes and disposed of them. He showered and changed. To disguise the killings as a hate crime, Seth spray painted the walls with the words, "Off Asians KKK." He then left the house, driving to a friend's place. The two spent the evening having dinner and playing video games in the city, establishing Seth's alibi. It wasn't until 11:48 p.m. that Seth called emergency services in a panic, claiming to have just discovered the bodies. Police initially took the scene and testimony of Seth at face value, assuming it was a racially motivated home invasion turned deadly. The brutal nature of the crime and the hateful graffiti left them fearing a killer was on the loose ready to strike another Asian family. The community was gripped with dread, but some things didn't add up. For an alleged robbery, little of value had actually been stolen from the house. And if it were a frenzied attack of hate, why would intruders remain in the home for over 3 hours to commit the murders? Investigators slowly turned their attention to Seth's suspicious behavior. The 20-year-old played the part of the grieving son. He made tearful television appeals for the killers to come forward. At the family's funeral, he gave an emotional eulogy and sang "One Sweet Day" by Boyz II Men. But behind the scenes, Seth's behavior was suspicious. He appeared detached and matter-of-fact when discussing the killings. Just days after losing his family, he was asking about the size of his inheritance, estimated at over $1.5 million. He moved into a fancy new apartment and put a deposit on a $173,000 Lexus, claiming he would use his expected inheritance to pay for it. Seth's stories to police were inconsistent. He couldn't adequately explain his whereabouts during the hours before the murders. The evidence started to stack up against him. previous poisoning attempts. Nearly a year after the killings, in June 2002, police had enough to arrest Seth and charge him with 3 counts of murder. Remarkably, earlier investigations uncovered a previous plot by Seth to poison his family. His browser history showed that he had researched toxic plants online and ordered poisonous seeds. A container of a plant-based poison was subsequently found in his room. Incidentally, Seth's mother Mary had fallen violently ill with food poisoning 3 months before the murders, suggesting a likely attempt run by Seth. With the poisoning attempts proving unsuccessful, Seth settled on a more decisive plan of attack against his family. The trial. Seth's murder trial began in May 2004. Prosecutors argued that he was driven by greed and resentment to kill his family. As the sole remaining heir, he was set to inherit his parents' estate and life insurance payouts, which served as the primary motivation for murder. They portrayed Seth as a narcissist and pathological liar who had been enraged at his family's attempts to control his life. He wanted freedom from their high expectations and discipline over his failing university grades. Slaughtering his family would get Seth the fortune and celebrity he craved. The prosecution case was strong. Substantial evidence supported the poisoning allegations. Paint matching the graffiti was found on Seth's clothes. Seth's alibis for the hours before the murders quickly fell apart under scrutiny. A taxi driver and sex worker he claimed to have been with were located by police, and both denied being with Seth that day. It became clear that Seth had ample opportunity to carry out the murders in the early evening before establishing his alibi with the friend. After a trial lasting just over 2 weeks, the jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Seth Gonzalez guilty on all charges. The judge handed down 3 life sentences for the murders, to be served concurrently with no possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Bruce James described the crimes as being in the worst category, with no mitigating factors to lessen Seth's culpability. He found Seth had carefully planned the murders and carried them out with extreme brutality. The judge said a life sentence was the only appropriate punishment for Seth's heinous crimes. Aftermath and reflections. Seth has always maintained his innocence. His lawyers launched an appeal in 2017, claiming some of his police interview statements may have been inadmissible as he wasn't cautioned. However, the appeal was dismissed as causing no substantial miscarriage of justice. In 2018 and 2019, Seth applied for a judicial review of his convictions, but these applications were also denied. A third attempt in 2021 was once again rejected by the courts. Now in his 40s, Seth Gonzalez remains behind bars, serving his life sentence at the Galburn Correctional Center. Barring a major development, he will likely spend the rest of his days in prison. The Gonzalez family murders are remembered as one of the most shocking crimes in Australian history. That a son could so viciously slaughter his own mother, father, and sister was unthinkable to most. Seth's lack of remorse and shameless greed after the killings only added to the public revulsion. His attempts to frame it as a hate crime exploited community fears and prejudices. In the end, Seth's own lies and inconsistencies became his undoing, leading police to the truth. While nothing can bring back those he killed, there is some justice in knowing Seth Gonzalez will never walk free again. For the extended family left behind, the murders brought unimaginable grief. Seth's aunt, Emily Luna, spoke of still loving her nephew despite his evil acts. How does a family ever recover from a trauma of this magnitude? They were left to carry on without 3 of their most cherished members, and to reconcile the boy they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer he became. The Gonzalez family, by all accounts, were good people, loving, hardworking, and devoted to their faith. They didn't deserve their cruel fate at the hands of the son they raised. Questions linger as to whether more could have been done to help Seth before he resorted to murder. A family friend reported that Teddy had confided in him about Seth's problems at university a year before the killings. Teddy had been at his wits' end trying to deal with his son's lies and rebellious behavior. In many ways, Seth displayed classic signs of a troubled teen spiraling out of control. The deception, the narcissism, the rejection of his family's values. Could earlier intervention have pulled Seth back from the brink? Or was he always destined for evil, his murderous nature hidden behind a baby face and charming smile? This was Agent Magpie, and remember guys, be good. And if you can't be good, be careful.